Thanks so much for joining us. Can you walk us through the Senate voter initiative proposal?
Sure. So this would simply make it so campaigns who are trying to put an initiative on the ballot would have to get a certain number of signatures from each of Idaho's 35 legislative districts. And right now, they have to get a certain number of signatures in 18 of the 35 legislative districts. So while the total number of signatures overall doesn't change, the geographic distribution is completely different, and it would require these campaigns to have people going into each of these 35 legislative districts across the state to get a certain number of signatures.
What's the logic from the bill sponsors?
Well, they say that right now you can get a whole lot of signatures, and most of an initiative put on the ballot in just a few counties across the state. And they say that rural Idaho needs more representation. But as we heard this morning from people like retired Boise State political science professor Gary Moncrief, rural Idaho has a whole lot of representation in the state house. A huge number of elected officials are from rural areas, and not to mention that their professions are largely, farming, ranching, these agrarian type of professions that they say need a bigger voice in the state house when there already is a huge influence there.
You know, this sounds pretty familiar to the conversation that we had 2 years ago when a similar proposal was in front of the legislature and got vetoed by Governor Little. How is this one different?
This one is different in the fact that it's not kind of like an assault from all angles, as those two bills were. I mean, that would have increased the total number of districts that would have been needed to qualify. It would have upped the signature requirements. It would have also lessened the time limit that campaigns have. Right now, they have 18 months, and that would have taken it down to 6 months, if I remember correctly. So, Governor Brad Little, like you mentioned, said that he worried that it would have been unconstitutional, and he said he reluctantly vetoed it, quote, because he didn't want the Ninth Circuit deciding what Idaho's initiative process would have been.
There were a whole lot of people who testified against this, many of whom have either been involved in past initiatives or have their eye on potential future ones. What were their concerns?
It's true, and it was largely what we heard 2 years ago too. Was they viewed this as kind of retribution for Medicaid expansion passing on the ballot by almost 61% in 2018, and there's some historical truth to that. For the past several decades, we've seen the legislature pass new laws and restrictions on the initiative process when, for example, term limits in the 90s passed. And, they didn't like that and they reversed it in the early 2000s. But so there was that. You also had, like you mentioned, the medical marijuana folks who are trying to get an initiative on the ballot. They are saying, well, this is directly aimed at us too. And there's some truth to that when you have the constitutional amendment from Senator Scott Grow that just passed the Senate, I believe, earlier this month, that would make, under the Constitution, it impossible for a citizens initiative to get any kind of medical marijuana on the ballot.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that how this effort plays into other conversations that the legislature is having right now. The obvious one is that medical marijuana initiative, but there's also a legislative effort to try and get medical marijuana passed in the state as well, although very restrictive. Um, I'm curious how this compares to other states that allow voter initiatives.
Yeah, and it's difficult to compare apples to oranges. I would say that when I've talked to experts across the country, they certainly say that Idaho is one of the more restrictive in the country. For example, we require 6%. This is really wonky, but we require 6% of the number of registered voters in the last general election. And only one other state is basing the signature requirement on the number of registered voters, whether or not they actually cast a ballot. And that's the big thing. Most states either require the signature requirement to be based on the number of votes cast in a presidential or gubernatorial election. If this were to pass, Idaho would be the only state in the country that would require these signatures come from each of the legislative districts. There are two states that require signatures coming from all congressional districts, but those are huge. I mean, congressional districts are vast. Idaho only has two, as opposed to 35.
We're talking about 6% of registered voters in a legislative district. Of course, there are big disparities between population sizes as some parts of Idaho have grown and others have shrunk just in the last 10 years. There are also disparities in the number of registered voters, but we have redistricting coming up. How might that change the picture?
Well, it's going to rebalance everything. Like you mentioned, Legislative District 27, which off the top of my head, I can't remember where that is, but it has the fewest number of
Mini
registered voters.
Kaja.
There
Mini
you go.
Kaja.
I like that you have that memorized. Minnecaja has just under 21,000 registered voters. And then, of course, the big one, District 14, Boise Suburbs, Eagle, Meridian, and Star, has 49,000. And I just looked at these this morning. So, I mean, we're talking about 28,000 people difference right there. Redistricting will rebalance that some, but certainly the population growth in Idaho has not been anywhere close to equal over the past 10 years. And so if this were to pass, then you would certainly see these more rural areas having far more of a voice in whether or not something gets on the ballot.
All right, James Dawson, Boise State Public Radio. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Melissa.